In India. Today we have here with us Dr. Prabakhar Patil. Dr. Patil has BTech. You know what? Just a sec. Suddenly the video just vanished. So I don't know whether it is recording or participants. Okay, seems to be okay. Okay. So hello, Plug-in India. Today we have here with us Dr. Prabakhar Patil. Dr. Patil has a BTech from IIT Bombay and PhD from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And he has decades of experience in automotive industry. Recently, he retired as a CEO of LGChem, one of the leading battery suppliers for plug-in hybrid vehicles and pure electric vehicles for several major automakers such as General Motors, Ford, Hyundai, and Volvo. Battery is obviously a very critical component of electric vehicle. And our Plug-in India community members were very eager to get the latest scoop of information in this area. That's why I reached out to Dr. Patil, and he graciously agreed to share his knowledge and insights with us. Welcome, Dr. Patil, and thanks for agreeing for this interview.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay. So we have several questions submitted from our forums for you. And the first question we have is, the lot of research groups, like we keep on hearing a lot of information about new battery technology and new chemistries and new developments, things like that. So, as of right now, lithium-ion seems to be the very well and established player. But what do you see as next big breakthrough, like a different chemistry, some other other configuration, or what?
Yeah, and that's, I guess, a very good question. You kind of have to go to the fundamentals because, as you know, lithium is the lightest metal and the third lightest element from the periodic table. So in terms of energy density and power density, in some sense, it has a very strong position. Obviously, hydrogen is the lightest, but as a gas, it stinks in terms of volumetric energy density in particular. And if you try to use it as a liquid, you lose a third of the energy in terms of going through the conversion. And there's many other challenges related to pumping it, being the lightest element, it diffuses out and so forth. And that's why fuel cells, I don't have much of, hope in terms of being practical for vehicle applications. There is other applications that they would work for. So, and of course, helium is inert. So that brings us back to lithium. So it's fairly safe to say that it's going to be some lithium variant in terms of batteries, and at least for next 10 years, again, it's a safe bet to say that it's going to be lithium-ion, some type of a flavor. And the reason for that time horizon is that it takes about 4 to 5 years after you have something working perfectly in the lab to be able to put it in a mass-produced vehicle on the road. For example, we have to give 10-year, 150,000-mile kind of warranties. So you have to convince yourself that you have good life in the batteries, and that's not something that can be significantly shortened. And of course, there is other types of validation. So given that time duration of 4 to 5 years, and given that there is nothing working perfectly in the lab, it's fairly safe that lithium-ion is going to be the battery of choice. But having said that, there are many, many variants of lithium-ion. In fact, a lithium-ion battery can and must be optimized for a given application. For example, if you look at requirements for, say, a non-plug-in hybrid vehicle, the power to energy ratio that would be needed from that battery versus what you would need in an extended range electric vehicle, it's almost a factor of 50 difference between the two. And so, it cannot be the same battery cannot work in all the different applications. And so it has to be customized. And beyond that, there is a lot of development that's going on in terms of improving the energy density of the batteries, reducing the cost, and so forth. So many, significant, development efforts are underway on cathode materials, anode materials, et cetera, et cetera. So to back off and summarizing the battery choice, particularly for vehicle applications and to some extent energy storage, at least for next 10 years, is going to be some form of lithium-ion. But that there will be, a lot of progress that will be made in lithium-ion itself.
Okay. So, there is, and we just recently heard like one big major announcement from Mr. Goodenough, and it made like headlines all over the world. And do you have any comments on that? Like how big?
Yeah. Of course, as you know, Professor Goodenough is sort of the father or grandfather of lithium-ion batteries, because he's the one who invented, and so he's a very respected scientist and gentleman, and so I think whenever he says something, you have to take it seriously as opposed to other people making claims. But having said that, I think he himself has acknowledged that there is still quite a bit of development that needs to happen. Oops, are you still there? Because, okay, my screen disappeared, so let's keep going. You still okay?
No, just a sec. Something happened here, and I was not able to say here. Basically, can you just repeat the?
Yeah. On Professor Goodenough. Yeah, it's he is the grandfather or father of lithium-ion batteries, and has a lot of credibility. So whenever he says something, we have to take it seriously. And I believe that he, has made a significant development. And this is more related to solid-state lithium-ion batteries. So it is still lithium-ion, and I'll get to that in a minute in terms of what it can do. But the point from a timing point of view, even that is not working at any significant scale in the lab. They have done some, proof of concept, but at a small scale. So first, it is sort of getting it working perfectly in the lab at a higher scale, and that may be a couple of years, 2-3 years. I don't know what the timing is, because some of the stuff you cannot predict how long it's going to take. But beyond that, then will be the 4 to 5 years, as I talked about earlier, to then get it into a production vehicle. So yes, I think it is something significant, but timing-wise, it'll still be a while before we see it in the vehicle. And what it is in terms of the solid state, as you probably know, the lithium-ion batteries currently use a liquid electrolyte that's put onto a separator, which is, so there's no liquid sloshing around, but the separator itself is damp. So it's a wet type of a system. And the solid state sort of replaces that with, as the name implies, a solid electrolyte. Some of the advantages of that is now you can significantly improve the energy density. Again, my screen sort of went blank for a minute. Assuming you're still there.
Well,
so I'll pause and
you stopped your webcam.
I'm sorry?
No, it's giving me a message saying stop your webcam, and I have not stopped. Like, I'm not doing anything, but it just apparently seems to stop my webcam every now and then for some reason. Okay.
Yeah.
But I was able to see you continuously.
Okay, so I'll keep going. So it'll improve the energy density of the cells. And of course, it can also enhance some of the safety. The main reason is you can, coat. Right now, the process that's used for making lithium ions is basically the electrode material is in the form of a slurry that gets coated onto the substrates for the cathode and anode, which are metal foils, aluminum for cathode and copper for the anode. And then you have the separator in between. So there is a lot of inactive material that is making up the bulk in terms of the volume as well as the mass within the cell. So the solid state allows you to significantly reduce the amount of sort of this inactive material, which then improves the energy density. Also, one of the challenges related to the safety that you have is with the separator itself, because if it gets penetrated by either whether it's a dendrite or impurities that are left in the cell, then there can be trouble, because then you get an internal short which can lead to a hot spot. And when that happens, some of the separators will melt, the hot spot gets bigger, which then, of course, increases the intensity of the heat source. And the electrolytes that are used are typically organic solvents that can vaporize and burn. And then some of the cathode chemistries will release oxygen. So you have a source of heat that's getting bigger, something that can vaporize and burn, and then a source of oxygen. And so then the cell takes off into a thermal runaway. But having a separator that cannot be penetrated for causing an internal short, of course, is a safety enhancement. So there are multiple elements, and presumably we should also be able to bring the cost down as a result of this. So I think it's got some promises, but it remains to be seen whether it can be, scaled up first in the laboratory and then in production. Because many times what happens is when you scale up some of these technologies, you lose some of the benefits and advantages that you may have seen on a small scale in the lab.
Right, I see. Okay, thank you. And the next question we have, and this is perhaps the, I will say most, a lot of people are interested in this, is we have seen pretty good trend in energy density improving.
Right.
So what trend do you see in energy density going, maybe next 5 years or a decade or so?
Yeah. And that again is, it looks like your members are pretty knowledgeable people in terms of what's happening in the battery world. But to just give some specifics, back in 2010, when the Chevy Volt with the V, and that was the first one that was kind of a mass-produced plug-in vehicle. We and the industry, from an energy density point of view, we were at about 160 watt-hours per kilogram. In fact, it was the leading edge at that point. That was a cell we had to specifically develop for the Volt. And cost-wise, we were at about $300 to $350 a kilowatt-hour in that time frame. Today, which is about 6-7 years since then, and I can say this openly because GM kind of published the cost numbers, but we are at about $150 a kilowatt hour at the cell level, so it's a factor of 2 improvement, but the energy density at the same time improved by 50%. We are at about 250 watt hours per kilogram, again at the cell level, starting with 160. So one simple way of looking at it is typically you need about 250 watt hours or a quarter of a kilowatt hour to go a mile of range. So it's 1 kilogram of battery at the cell level for a mile of range, and that's what's enabling. And in terms of volumetric energy density, we are about maybe 500 to 600 watt hours per liter in terms of the volume of the cell. So, the 200 mile range, for example, at the cell level, therefore would require like a 200 kilograms of battery. And when you add all the other stuff that goes in the pack, it's maybe 400 kilograms of battery. And, if you therefore you could not do it with, say, nickel metal hydride or lead acid, because nickel metal hydride now is lower by a factor of 3. So in other words, you would need 1,200 kilograms of battery, and that would be, as way as much as the vehicle itself. And lead acid, it would be significantly more than the vehicle. So that's one of the big enablers with lithium-ion, is the energy density capability that it offers. That's what enables making these extended range electric vehicles, or even the plug-in vehicles. And the new trend that's emerging is for these extended range vehicles, like what Tesla did. People in the past were trying to stuff batteries in the available space in IC, internal combustion engine vehicle. But now they're sort of starting to build vehicles around the battery pack. And when you do that, you can get a much better vehicle configuration and architecture, like the Tesla type of a configuration, where the pack is only about 100 millimeters tall, or 4 inches. So at that height, you can put it underneath the load floor in the car, still have enough ground clearance without raising the floor too high. And now you have space going from wall to wall, so to say, front to back and left to right underneath the vehicle, where you can package this battery. And that has another advantage of lowering the center of gravity of the vehicle, so the ride becomes much more stable. So people are just starting to realize some of the benefits of building a purpose-built electric vehicle. And actually, you can simplify a lot of other things in the vehicle, because the electric system, as you know, is inherently smoother, because the initial motion itself is circular, as opposed to in an IC engine, where you have to take linear motion and convert it, and it's inherently unbalanced with the number of cylinders. So a lot of what we call NVH, noise, vibration, harshness issues go away. And that allows you to simplify even the structure, the frame and the sheet metal and so forth in the vehicle, significantly reduce the number of parts. Like I have heard numbers of, 2 orders of magnitude, factor of 100.
Wow.
Fewer parts in this propulsion system, which cuts down on the amount of time that it takes to build a vehicle. They're also much more reliable. So I think all of those factors are sort of going towards making them more practical. But coming back to your original question, the energy density of lithium-ion has played a very critical role in doing this, and we're not done yet. Like I said, today we are at about 250 watt-hours per kilogram at the cell level, but by 2025, I think people will be able to get to 300, 350. There is a theoretical limit, which is around, I think, little under 500 watt-hours per kilogram, but there is still quite opportunity for further improvement. So both the cost and the energy density will continue to improve for lithium-ion.
Great, that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
So, and the next question we have is, as far as lithium-ion battery kilowatt hour cost is considered, how close we are, at what point we will cross or break the $100 kilowatt hour threshold, because everyone seems to think that that's where the electric cars will be at cost parity with internal combustion engine cars.
Well, see, that number is I will talk about the cost, but I guess the thing I want to point out is that I'm not sure where that number came from, because really, and we have to be clear about what we mean by cost parity, because the big advantage of electric vehicles is their running costs. For example, even if you had, and I'll take the US example, and we can come to the Indian example in a minute, but in the US, gasoline right now is cheap, but that still is $2.50 a gallon. And so let's say if you get 25 miles to a gallon, that's still 10 cents a mile of running costs. Whereas electric vehicles, as I mentioned, is quarter of a kilowatt hour per mile. And that is typically 8 cents for a kilowatt hour, which means it's about 2 to 2.5 cents a mile. So it's a factor of 4 to 5, even at this price of gasoline. And of course, in India, it's much more exacerbated because you probably are paying, a little more for gasoline or petrol, although the fuel economy of vehicles is better. But there's still that factor of 4 to 5. But the issue is people don't buy vehicles based on life cycle cost. They buy them based on transaction price. And of course, purchase price, the electric vehicles will always have a disadvantage because, engine and transmission, typically you can think of as motors and power electronics, will, cancel that out. But you're basically left with a net difference between the battery and the fuel tank, because those are the equivalents. And obviously the battery is not going to be, coming down in cost to be the same as the fuel tank. So you have to look at life cycle. The only other part you should consider is the emission equipment, particularly for diesels, because now with the stringent emission requirements and all the attention that they're getting, the cost of after treatment to get it down to what California calls the SULEV emission standards, it can be a couple of $1,000s a vehicle. And, that's coming to a point where, they can be somewhat close to a parity for the electric vehicles, but that's not really the right way of looking at it. So coming back to, battery costs, as I mentioned, at the cell level, we were at about $300 to $350 a kilowatt hour back in 2010. Today, we are at about $150 a kilowatt hour. Again, at the cell level, to convert it to pack, you have to add another maybe 30%. So that would be like $200 a kilowatt hour. And I'm reasonably comfortable, confident, I guess, that by 2020, at the cell level, again, we'll be somewhere between $100 to $120. And by 2025, we should be able to get to $100 or a little below at the cell level. But the pack level, it would still be more like $120 a kilowatt hour. But I think, that's going to be very attractive. In fact, even now, the Volt or the Tesla's Model 3 is going to be priced at about $35,000, which is the median price of a vehicle in the U.S. And when you have no limitations, because when you have 200 miles of range and you're able to recharge, say, in 15 minutes, that vehicle can become the primary vehicle for the family, as opposed to only for commuting reasons. And so that could be the turning point, and we're waiting to see what the market response is. I mean, we already know for Tesla, 400,000 people put down this $1,000 deposit. And even though that's not a commitment because it is a refundable deposit, it just tells you the pent-up demand. Because so far, the electric vehicle business has been regulation-driven. And it's possible that this price point and this performance may finally turn it into what I call a customer-driven. And of course, as the battery prices fall further, it's only going to improve that situation.
I see. Okay. And and this is somewhat of an India-centric question. And how substantial will be the cost reduction in electric vehicles if lithium-ion batteries are produced in India instead of being imported? So,
well, I guess some of that depends on if there is, import duties, which I don't really know. But in terms of the cost structure of the batteries, there really isn't that big of a difference. One of the things that happens, and that's why we, meaning LG, are setting up factories wherever the vehicle is made, because the biggest challenge you have is in terms of shipping these unwieldy packs. So it's better to make the pack where the vehicle is being made. But apart from that, if you make the batteries in India or US or Europe or Korea or China, the cost remains approximately the same, because if you look at the cost breakdown of a cell today, about 65% of the cost is materials. And that's going to be the same. And then some percentage is amortization of the equipment. That again doesn't really change with the location that you have. The labor costs only make up maybe 5, 7%. So that's the only variable that you may get. And of course, then other are utility costs. So some of that will depend on just the infrastructure. So it's not a major advantage or big difference in terms of making it, except for the shipping, which is a big deal. And so for that reason, if the volume gets high enough to justify setting up a factory, those will be set up. And what I mean by gets high enough, typically these factories will be set up for maybe a capacity of 2 to 3 gigawatt hours. You don't need a 35 gigawatt hour like what Tesla is trying to do, but you can get a lot of economies of scale if you can get to about 2 to 3 gigawatt hours. So, but you have to have enough vehicles to justify that. And as we just talked about, you need a quarter of a kilowatt hour for a mile. So that means a 200-mile vehicle will typically have 50 to 60 kilowatt hour pack. So then it doesn't take that many. If you had 16,000 of the 60 kilowatt hour packs, you are at a 1 gigawatt hour of capacity, unit volume. But you have to have sufficient vehicle, volume to justify running the factory at close to capacity, because otherwise you become very inefficient, and then the cost goes up. So that's kind of the equation about setting up a local production facility.
I see. One question we have is, as the electric vehicles become more and more common, and there are more batteries available for recycling, maybe at some point there will be significant chunk of new batteries will be made from recycling. How will that affect the cost? Will that make a big difference or not much?
Yeah, no, it's again, that's a good question. See, what we call end of life in vehicle batteries, the battery still has about 70 to 75% of its energy left in it at that point, at the 10-year, 150,000 miles. So it still has life, but the secondary usage may be more for stationary energy storage, where the energy density is not that big of a criteria because you're not constrained by space or mass. And then the batteries could be used for another 5-7 years, depending on what the duty cycle is, until you get, because the battery degradation is such that until it gets to about 50%, it's fairly linear. But once you get to 50%, then it's a very sharp drop off, and that's when you don't want to continue using the battery anymore. But in terms of recycling, today people will pick up these consumer electronics batteries, laptops or cell phones that are lithium-ion, free of charge from you, take them and recycle them. But the main element that provides them with value is cobalt, because that's the expensive material. And what we are trying to do on vehicle side batteries is actually minimize the amount of cobalt, because today the popular chemistries that are being used are so-called NMC, which is nickel, manganese, cobalt, or NCA, which is nickel, cobalt, and aluminum. And we started out where it was 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in terms of nickel, manganese, and cobalt. Today, it's maybe more like 60% nickel and down to 20% cobalt, and it's trying to even take it down to maybe 10% cobalt, which is then going to make a questionable value proposition from an economic point of view, whether people will be able to get enough value. Now, that equation could be different, for example, in India, because the battery also has things like this copper and aluminum foils that are used as the substrates. So the question will become, is there a value proposition? But the good news is that the battery is fairly benign environmentally. As you know, lithium itself gets prescribed medically. for people who have this bipolar condition, lithium. So you could theoretically put the battery in a landfill and not really have any bad consequences from an environmental perspective. So then it comes down to the economic value equation as to whether recycling would make sense, or at what point recycling would make sense.
I see. Okay. And do you see net metering solar panels and battery storage as a combined solution with evolving in distributed power generation in recent future, especially for countries like us?
That's right. In fact, that's where it makes the most sense. Places like Michigan, where we see sun maybe 20% of the time, it wouldn't make a good sense. But India, fortunately, has abundance of solar energy that's available, and that's very promising value equation, whether at the major grid level or at individual customer level, because people with, let's say, private houses who would have enough of a roof area to be able to put the solar panel could indeed become grid independent with the combination of the solar panel and a battery to store the energy. So that is, very, I guess, viable value proposition for India.
Okay. We need more sustainable business models, and that can be part of, or live in harmony with this whole planet and our environment. Can recycling or upcycling of batteries, can that itself be a profitable business? Yeah,
like I mentioned before, it's questionable because it has been or was for batteries that used a lot of cobalt, lithium-ion batteries that used a lot of cobalt, but as that comes down, it becomes economically, it remains to be seen. But obviously, the good part is that you're not forced to recycle from an environmental impact perspective. But if you can, and if it's a value proposition, then I think we should, and people will figure out a way to do that. But the immediate thing may be using them when they come out of the vehicles into stationary energy storage. The challenge that we have there is standardization, because you want to have a situation where you don't want to spend a lot of time, effort, or money in remanufacturing the battery, which means you have to be able to bolt together the battery packs that come out of the vehicles. And the only way you could do that is they were standardized, and no such standard exists today. But that, I think, is something that is being developed, and that will facilitate the secondary usage of vehicle batteries.
I see. Okay. And this question is specific to LGChem. Does LGChem have any plans of setting production in India? Any development or partnerships or anything going on?
Well, obviously, I can't talk specifically about business plans or what's going on with LG, but the general statement that I can make, as I mentioned earlier, LG would be very willing and happy to set up a production facility if there is a sustainable business and volume requirement, because sometimes these things get started because of government incentives, and that's not a sustainable business proposition, because governments can change, they can change their mind, etc., etc. However, if you have a sustainable market for vehicles, and therefore that has to come from the industry, the automotive industry leaders, like if Tata or Mahindra or any of the other OEMs were to say, hey, we're going to make so many 100,000 or whatever, and it wouldn't even have to be 100,000, as we talked about, even 20 to 30,000 volume annually could provide enough of battery demand to be able to basically it's justifying or providing a market for a couple of gigawatt hours a year of battery. And then the factory can, because we just set up a factory in China. Of course, even the U.S. one that I was involved in, that we have had in operation now in Holland for some time. And we are setting up a facility in Europe, in Poland, for the European application. Then there is so wherever there is the demand and the customers, and like I mentioned before, it makes sense to make the batteries where the vehicles are being made to avoid having to ship these battery packs. So there isn't anything magical about setting up in India. It's just that there has to be a sustainable business.
Right. Okay. And that's a good segue into this next question. So, what are your projections on spreading electric vehicles in India in, say, and also in the rest of the world in the next decade?
Well, actually, that's a question for you or the Indian, industry, because I know that the government is doing the right things of pushing very hard for electrification, and actually for India, it makes a lot of sense, particularly for two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which are a major source of pollution, as well as buses, can have a significant impact. So to me, those would be the segments that we can start with. Because particularly fleets of taxis or rickshaws or delivery vehicles and buses, the value equation would make sense immediately, because as we talked about the operating costs versus between the two, that will pay off for the battery within a period of a couple of years. And then it's sustained by a genuine economic equation, plus just improving the uptime, because the reliability of these vehicles is so good compared to the internal combustion engine vehicles that it makes all kinds of sense. So those will be the segments. I think that there probably will be some help needed from the government, and I think the government, from what I see, is doing everything that it can. So the next ingredient would be for the vehicle industry to get into it. And it's, I have to be careful how I say it. This is not a space that's ideally suited for startups, partly because it takes so much investment. So you have to have the staying power for a few years, and the startups have a hard time doing that because they're continuously fighting for next round of funding. You cannot do it with government subsidies either, so it has to be established players. So that should be the next step, and I think when that happens and they get into it, then I think it will come to fruition. But I don't really have a good feel for where the industry leaders are in India, and that's why I say it's more of a question for you. Being there, you probably have a better feel for where things are and how they're going.
Right. We do have. Oftentimes, we have a biased opinion, so we tend to ask around other educated people as well. And on this question, let me just tag along one more question, because that question seems to be discussed a lot, and we just want your thoughts on this one, whatever thoughts you can provide. When we say spread of electric vehicles, we are mostly talking about new electric vehicles, the vehicles that are made as electric vehicle from ground up. Do you see any serious potential for conversion of existing internal combustion or into electric vehicles that gaining popularity or becoming profitable or not?
Well, I guess it could make sense in India. It's not as much of a market, for example, in the US or other places. Back here, for reasons I talked about, people are now starting to see the synergy of purpose-built electric vehicles, even for new, developing the vehicle from scratch to be an electric vehicle, rather than a platform that already exists that is developed for internal combustion and then fitting batteries. So those are still new vehicles, but it's much better to do it with a purpose-built electric vehicle. So that's a scenario here. But in India, particularly if you're trying to use non-plug-in hybrids, for example, and they can provide significant improvement in fuel economy, because a lot of the traffic, particularly for two-wheelers, three-wheelers, delivery vehicles, is stop and go. and you can have a very, here it was factor of 2, it could be even higher. Because a lot of the times with IC engines, you're just burning fuel when they're idling or standing still and so forth. So there it can, and something like a non-plug-in hybrid, you can actually do a fairly good job of doing a conversion because A, the battery is relatively small, so you don't have to find significant space in the vehicle, and B, your internal combustion engine powertrain stays mostly intact. You just have to add this additional electrical system, so that could make sense. I guess the only other comment that I would make, and this is not necessarily specific to India, is that there is a growing synergy between automated vehicles, autonomous vehicles, driving vehicles, or ride-shared vehicles and electric vehicles. In fact, all of the ride-shared and autonomous vehicles are likely to be electric vehicles for a couple of reasons. One is the reliability, because as you know, the conventional vehicle, the duty cycle is only 5%. It gets driven maybe 1 hour out of the day, 24 hours, and the remaining 23 hours is sitting parked someplace, either at home or at work. But when you get to ride-shared vehicles, that utilization is going to jump to 80-90% because those vehicles could be in use around the clock. And then the reliability becomes a big deal of internal combustion engine versus the electric vehicles. And that, in addition to the simplicity of the vehicle that we talked about, the indications are that, those vehicles are going to be primarily electric. And so that synergy is also going to play into growing the volume of electric vehicles as we go forward.
I see. Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Patil. That was a very, very informative interview. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Plug-in India community over here, big thank you to you.
You're more than welcome. Okay. Have a good evening.
Thank you, you too. So I just hope now it is properly recorded.
Okay. Okay. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, for some reason, I'm not seeing a way to stop recording. Is there a way to stop recording? Oh, sorry, I have it here.
Okay, because I have no clue. This is that I've never done this before, so you're
okay.
breaking new ground.